Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back again to talk about the changes for the healer meta in 8.3, alright? In our previous edition, we started looking at some of the bosses, and it sort of came down to the conclusion that Paladins and Disc Priests were still too overpowered, and that the rest of the healers, specifically Mistweaver, Resto Druid, and Holy Priest, were still lagging behind, while Shaman offered a good mix of sacrificing damage, to do tons of healing, or sacrificing healing to do tons of damage. So going into this, we wanted to start looking at the latest changes that happened 2 days ago from the time of this video, and what it means for the healer meta as we're wrapping up, or basically in the middle of our Mythic raid testing. So, starting it off, we've got Monk changes. Rising Mist. Now previously, it was extending the duration of your HOTS off your Rising Sun Kick by 4 seconds, and instead of 2, and was offering a 66% healing increase. Now that healing increase is at 33%, so it goes from 66 plus 66% to plus 33%, which is very weird. And as I mentioned, Mistweaver does seem to be lagging behind, not really in throughput. I've seen a mix of Upwelling and Rising Mist gameplay coming out on the PTR, and they've all had pretty good results, but it's lagging behind in terms of the utility that it's bringing. And even if it's able to do an equitable job to Paladins and Disc Priests, they need to be having a little bit more, because Devotion Aura, Barrier, and the passive damage that both of those healers do exists. Angling Mistweaver Monk in the direction of Rising Mist helps assuage some of the issues of passive damage. So Rising Mist incentivizes them to always be using Rising Sun Kick, which deals quite a hefty amount of damage, on cooldown as often as possible to make sure they're extending the duration of relevant HOTS. That being said, they didn't bother pushing forward a DPS increase for Blackout Kick and Rising Sun Kick, which affected Windwalker monks, and they did not have it affect Mistweaver monks. Kind of weird, especially if they're angling to have Mistweaver start dealing some more damage. Confusing. Holy Paladin. Last time we talked about it, Glimmer of Light was getting capped, and now we've seen that Glimmer of Light is getting another nerf once again, much to the dismay of Paladins everywhere. But that being said, Paladin has been absolutely crushing it lately on PTR, as I mentioned. You're checking the footage right now. This is before the Azerite trait Glimmer nerf that we're talking about right now. It's just beforehand, but they're still able to put up some very hefty HPS while dishing out good passive damage. And even if they were doing less healing, they still bring Devotion Aura to the table. And a lot of these fights are going to be having heavy ticking damage, heavy spot damage in particular. So more damage reduction, just really good. I wouldn't worry too much about Paladin's position in the rating group. They're still excellent. Discipline Priest. Now, the first side of this, I think, is quite understandable. Purge the Wicked and Shadow Pain receiving damage nerfs. These are the nerfs that happen to Shadow Priest as well, so it's no surprise to start seeing them happen to Discipline, because a lot of these fights, in addition to being very spot heavy, very sustained damage heavy, which works well with our dots converting into periodic healing effects, otherwise known as HOTS. Works pretty well if we're able to multi-dot a number of mobs, maintain them, then ramp up and do a ton of extra healing off of it. It makes sense. That being said, Solace is a bit of a surprise, seeing a 10% nerf to its damage as well, which might also incentivize Discipline Priest to start playing around with mine better. I'll keep you guys posted on that end, but weird to see that damage nerf come in. Now, that being said, with these changes, everybody started kind of questioning themselves. Why is Mistweaver getting some of their buff taken away? And what's going to happen with Paladins and Disc Priests, who are at a medium and a moderate level in Mythic Plus, but they don't scale up to the power of the Resto Druid? So, one day later, we start seeing the Resto Druid nerf come in. So, Harmony, the mastery for Resto Druids, getting nerfed by 9%, while High Noon, the Azerite trait that increases the range and damage of Sunfire, is also going to be getting nerfed by 34%, just for Resto Druids. Now, their note on this one. Resto Druid has an overall package of healing, damage, and utility that's very hard to compete with in solo healed content, aka Mythic Plus or PvP. Two things that stand out in particular are the efficiency of focused healing on a single target with high mastery, so stacking HOTS onto one target, and the ease of contributing DPS with very little GCD usage. So, this makes sense, but just like Disc Priest and Paladins were curious as to how these nerfs affect them in Mythic Plus, Now Rested Druids are up in arms because this will also affect them in raids where they're severely lacking in terms of extra value past just healing. When we're looking at the healing balance that starts going into the next raid with Ny'alotha, this is going to be following us. This balance is going to be there for, conceivably, 10 to 12 months. We're going to be playing with it in and out consistently. And one of the biggest problems that stands out is that we're not seeing substantive change in what the healer meta is doing. We're still going to be having the same problems as Disc and Holy Paladin dominating raids, while Rested Druid dominates Mythic Plus. The power level for these things is so high, but if you check out the developer's note for Rested Druid, which is why we still have it up, you'll notice that they start talking about healing and damage, and they put in nerfs to healing and damage. But they don't ever touch utility. They don't ever touch the utility of the different specializations, whether it is Resto Druid or Disc Priest and Paladin mid-expansion. And this mainly, I think, is because they are more looking to keep the status quo until they go into the new expansion, and then they're able to start making greater changes. That being said, I personally have lost quite a bit of confidence in it because we're constantly in the same scenario. Last expansion, same story. Resto Druid was absolutely dominant in Mythic Plus, as was Paladin. And Disc Priest and Paladin were crushing it in a raiding environment. The only difference was there was 2 healers you could bring for Mythic Plus, and there was a lot of 4 or 5 healer fights in Antorus compared to what we saw in Eternal Palace, where many of the encounters you're trying to cut down on them as much as you can. We'll see how many fights in Ny'alotha will be more 4 or 5 healer based, but if they're not, or if the continued power creep of healers makes it so that you can cut down on them as you get near the end boss, then it's going to continue to lead certain healers out in the cold. Namely, the ones that are not mentioned. Holy Priest, Resto Druid, and Mistweaver in a raiding environment are just struggling to find the proper area where they sit. And that's because they've consistently never had some kind of bonus utility that's helped them stand out. We saw some niche effects with like moving Tranquility, for example, on Iminar in the Antorus raid, where you have to run and heal at the same time. Well, that's really good for moving Trank, but that's 1 encounter out of 12. And that wasn't an end boss either. So that being said, you start looking at some of these changes, nerfs, and it's a reinforcement of the status quo. And then when the new expansion comes around, that status quo is maintained and even protected in many cases. Barrier and Devotion Aura are still incredible cooldowns that go out. At least with something along the lines of Spirit Link, we've had times where it has been more or less valuable. But in Eternal Palace in particular, it wasn't as valuable because Resto Shaman was something that either dealt damage and popped cooldowns, or it was a full-on healer. And because there was such a large sacrifice for your own throughput by taking heavy igneous potential to crank out massive single target damage, they didn't see that much play in Eternal Palace at the very top bleeding edge. Now what I'm talking about with this is that we're not really going to be seeing any big differences because history is continuing to repeat itself. It's been expansion after expansion where Paladins and Disc Priest have been dominant, and while Mythic Plus is very new, Rested Druid doesn't seem like its mastery or like its massive Swiss Army knife of utility abilities is going away anytime soon. In fact, when we're talking about the unpruning for the Shadowlands, it just seems like Rested Druid will be gaining more tools at a baseline level for them to continue working with. This is incredibly harmful, not only to making sure you're able to get your 10 or 15 weekly done and people declining you on that end, but also just making sure that people are feeling that there's opportunities to outplay these things, or opportunities to stand out as this healer spec or that healer spec, whether it's in raids, whether it's in Mythic Plus. So the argument that they should wait until the next expansion has been kind of bunk for me, because last expansion was the same thing. Hellfire Citadel was much of the same thing. Mistweaver had some strengths there, a lot of times tied to some of the bonuses specifically to Hellfire Citadel. We go even further back onto that one with Mr. Pandaria, Discipline Priest Paladin still had some amazing strengths. And while they came from different areas, from absorption effects to damage reduction and all the rest, there were still specific areas that are left unchanged and sort of left out there, or they get replaced by something even more powerful or that grows even more powerful. Paladin has rough times at the beginning of the expansion and dominates at the end. Discipline Priest can be a mixed bag. They redesign, it doesn't work out how they want, they redesign again, and then it's brought everywhere all the time, constantly. If there's going to be substantive change, they need to start working on how they're going to revamp any healer specs. And if they're focusing on being mainly additive, then they need to start adding some substantial benefits to the existing healing battery healers, right? Resto Druid, Mistweaver Monk, Holy Priest in particular stand out as these healers that do very well in 30-man environments and very well at the beginning of some expansions when throughput is null, void, and low, right? But to that point, as the expansion grows and processes and develops, those three healers start just kind of moving down and slacking off just a little bit because damage reduction is so valuable. Damage reduction is so valuable with greater tuning for the encounters where healer DPS really matters, which I personally enjoy. It's a nightmare for those other healers because they don't naturally have good forms of contributing passive damage. We're looking at a whole new revamp of the healer situation by changing encounters, but not changing the abilities that these healers have to deal with them. So those who are already well equipped, like Paladins and Disc Priests, crushed Eternal Palace because of tight tuning, bursts of heavy damage, and absolute loads of utility and throughput at their disposal. Ny'alotha is going to be the last raid of the expansion, and they have a lot of opportunities to start making those changes. If they're going for band-aid fixes mid-expansion, nerfing the damage reduction values out of Barrier and Devotion Aura is a good start. If they're looking at long-term changes for a new expansion, then something must be done in terms of adding new absorption effects, damage increases for healers that don't have it, new ways for them to convert damage into healing in more limited capacities, not just like Disc Priest, but something more akin to Way of the Crane, as well as making sure that there's a different benefit and unique benefit, which I understand is harder than it sounds, right? Just add something new. It's much harder than it sounds, but I think that this should be a priority for them early in Shadowlands development if they want to keep time from being a flat circle. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. Let me know what you think and what kind of changes you'd like to see for some of these healers going into the Shadowlands, or if there's even some decent 8.3 changes they could start making to some of these specializations before the raid comes out. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I'm Jack, and be sure to subscribe for more video content and check out the live stream below.